think about the process I just described, you see kind of the main reason that this is different from a traditional grant, and that we don't have the money up front. Right? We get the proposals, we score them, rank them, and then we go, leverage our relationships to solicit funding. Yes. So we have a rolling notice of funding opportunity, and our advisory council meets quarterly to review projects and score them. So kind of the timeline there is that we'll score these things quarterly. Then I have to bring them and get our internal approvals from Big T and C, and then we go out and solicit funding. So, I guess the main way that difference affects folks is a little bit of uncertainty in the time, right? You have certainty in when they're going to be scored. It's going to be like, a month after that, we're out there soliciting funds. So far, we've got immediate funding for everything, right? We funded 3 projects. But I don't know that that's always going to be true. Maybe it takes 6 months or more, so at some point in the future. So QR code here. This is our notice of funding opportunity. It's a little bit out of date. I haven't updated this since our last stakeholder coalition meeting where I got some feedback. Kind of the main thing that needs to be updated is you'll see that we've changed these eligible project boundaries to preferred project boundaries. So, the original area was the Upper Scioto and Licking River watershed. But, what there really needs to be is just corporate demand for the projects in those regions. And so we're open to hearing about the projects. If you don't know if there's going to be corporate demand, just give me a call and we'll talk about it. These are the 3 projects that we've funded so far, and you can already see that one of them right here in the Hocking River was outside of that priority area. We're probably going to be recruiting pretty hard for the upper Great Miami River pretty soon. And these things can change very fast. I mean, everyone knows that there's data centers going in all over the state. Kind of the difference in some other regions is some places there are like all these small, weird subsidiary companies that no one's ever heard of. And those aren't really the types of companies that have mature sustainability programs right now. But as the hyperscalers move in and perhaps as pressure builds on these smaller companies, the opportunities are very likely to grow considerably. So with that, can you paste them on? It's on and off. Well, these are the projects that we've funded so far. And I'm not going to kind of get into like the details on these various projects right now. Glad to answer questions, but they're all floodplain reconnection projects. Okay, we've got 2 kind of off-channel wetland projects. We've got a quarry reconnection project. And these are great because they're scoring super high. They've got, a million different benefits. And importantly, they're easy to sell from the volumetric benefit standpoint. But that is not all that works. And the reason that these are the ones that have been funded is because these are the ones that people are bringing forward. We've got, frankly, a small handful of folks that are taking advantage of the opportunity. And, we've got $4 million out in two grant cycles. Which, by the way, it's worth stepping back and saying that, if you think of kind of some of the other grant opportunities, like the 319 program, it's typically $3 million for the entire state in a year. Or, H2 Ohio, before they pulled back from the Ohio River Basin, that was $5 million for the entire Ohio River Basin. This is just Central Ohio right now. And we just did $3 million in this last fund. So it's a big opportunity, and we're expecting it to grow. So let's take advantage of it. So it becomes stormwater retrofit. And, you know, one of the reasons that I'm kind of starting here with pounding my hand on the table saying, let's see some projects, is because I happen to know that these. If folks are familiar with smart detention retrofit projects, where you have kind of, you know, the automated valve that's controlled and has inputs from like the weather and how much water is currently in the pond and how much water might be in other ponds to make smart decisions. Through one of our other North America region programs called Bright Storm, those folks have funded several across the U.S. with corporate water. So, you know, the thing about these is, and I haven't done a smart retrofit, but what I can say about the ones that have been funded is they've been very expensive, like to the tune of more than 400 grand for a single base. Can they be done cheaper than that? I hope so. I don't know. But, you know, the detention basin retrofits that I'm used to working on, like from the passive side, are a fraction, right? These can involve something as small as bolting a steel plate under the low flow orifice to kind of restrict that, making a few saw cuts like we see on this control structure right here. And Bob will talk a lot about that. Obviously, whenever possible, we want to build a habitat, right? But to the extent that we can do these for, you know, 40,000 instead of 400,000, I mean, I've got to think we can just fund these all day. So, you know, my message here is let's do this, but let's also think big. So currently, if you read the note, the minimum award that we're considering is 50,000. Now, you know, to be frank, that might be kind of hard to say. Might be hard to convince a corporation to invest their time on something so small when many of these folks are looking for hundreds of millions or billions of gallons of volumetric thing. And frankly, it's hard for me to sell internally to spend that much administration time. The smallest award we've given out so far is 700,000. I'm not saying it needs to be, you know, $1 million, but I'm saying let's think big. Let's not think about retrofitting a single detention basin. Let's think about retrofitting every detention basin in an industrial. And you know, I'll just step. You know, I think a lot of folks like to kind of do, you know, the detention basin at the school or the municipal building because it's easy. We know these people, we can go and we can talk to them. I in my former role, I spent, you know, all my time trying to work in one square. My goal was to figure out this question: how much does it take to, you know, mitigate the impacts of hydrologic alteration in a small area? And what I can tell you from that experience, because we had a small industrial park, is every single private landowner with a detention basin said, fine, you can retro. I didn't get a single no. I got a lot of people laughing and rolling their eyes at it. But no one said no when you're not asking them. So, you know, I'll just say think big. Kind of briefly, bioretention, I'm assuming this is going to be a hit out of the park too. I think, you know, when you compare when you start looking at volumetric water benefit and how they're calculated, when you have drainage areas that are dominated by impervious surface, it just generates a lot of volume for the cost compared to some of the other projects that we're doing. So to know these things, we need examples. We need people to bring forth projects, and we'll model it out. And we'll see how competitive it's, and then we'll learn and we'll adjust our notice of funding opportunity. So let's think big. Let's pump these out and take advantage of this money while it's here. The next advisory council meeting is going to be on October 14th. I need some time to prepare, so we'll put a deadline for that meeting of the end of September. So give me a call as soon as possible. We'll help. We got resources to help develop the projects, but we'll certainly help with volumetric water benefit. And be a resource for whatever y'all need to help. And with that, I'll just put that QR code back up on the screen. And not sure, do you want to do questions individually or after? Wait until the last portion.
If folks have a couple burning questions now, we can do that. Anybody online?
Stipulations in terms of regulatory requirements, like if there are regulatory benefits or I don't know, if 319 can't be used for something that's mandated or receive, I'll call it regulatory credit. Does that matter?
Yeah, I think that's one, it's just good philanthropic practice. But two, it raises questions about, would that benefit actually have happened otherwise? And they're very, very sensitive to greenwashing claims. And that's where the third party comes in. And so you're going to have to get those third parties to sign off on it. I think, we've had a lot of this discussion in terms of detention basin retrofit. And what if it needs maintenance? What if it needs to be dredged out? I think that we can sell that, particularly if we're going to let's just expand it a little. If we got the equipment out there, and I don't think anyone's gonna say, oh, well, this is a problem because you dredged out some sediment that needed to happen. If we're, retrofitting the control structure and maybe doing a little tiny expansion on a corner, I think we can justify it, but we do have to be careful.
So if I'm hearing it right and relating it to 319 or Ohio or anything, as long as it's a retrofit, you're probably okay. But the new project, a new development coming in, they're not going to be able to access these to put in stormwater or even probably increase what they're proposing, right?
I guess, so say we want to go above and beyond, and can they fund the first part? Well, they can fund whatever they want. But when we work with the quantifiers, they're only going to get credit for that delta, right? That increase above and beyond. And so as long as the numbers work, they're not going to do it if it's not hitting their target of less than $10,000 to $30,000 per million gallons.
In terms of the stream protection, does that look like just funds for land acquisition?
Yeah, good question. So this has been the main priority of the stakeholder coalition from the very beginning. Everyone wants acquisition. And especially in this context of these are typically the folks that are driving up land prices to the point where we can't protect them. Frankly, I've just given up on the acquisition. I recently was working with a partner that had a piece of property for $15,000 an acre. Now, one thing we are trying to explore is, so what if it's a reasonably priced property like $15,000, and then we put an off-channel wetland? Can that off-channel wetland carry the acquisition forward? Maybe. My preliminary calculations of one project like that was, it'd be like $30,000 per million gallons. And that's kind of right at that threshold, right? Where maybe it's not going to sell the next day, but yeah, maybe put in 6 months or a year and we'll get it done. So we'll see. But easements all day long. Yeah, I haven't done an easement where we paid the landowner for the value. I have no concerns from the company's standpoint. I do worry as a 501c3, how our lawyers are going to take that, because we can't give any disproportionate benefit. But if it's not above market value, I think
Do you think there's any appetite for projects that maybe aren't as tangible, like trying to get a bunch of stormwater retrofits done, tree planning and studies and stuff like that?
So we've had this conversation and we're gonna try to sell that, right? I mean, for example, these off-channel wetlands. You know, one of our big problems with those is if it doesn't have a gauge station nearby, you know, we basically need like a HEC-RAS model or something to estimate water measured benefit. And so we're creating a proposal like that where we're going to sell it as this is an enabling project. It's beans to you. But if you do this, we will generate 10 new projects and we'll give you the first bite at the apple for those projects. And so we haven't done that yet, but you know, that's the way.
Any other questions from folks online or in person with us here? I was gonna say, I'm 6 minutes. I don't want to take up last time.
So can you walk us through, the project comes in, the group likes it, proposes it to the corporate funders, they fund it. What's the flow through of the funds? Does that come all through TNC? Does it go to the community, the implementer? How's that side of it?
So TNC administers the grant. So it goes, advisory council approves, TNC approves, solicited. They say, yes, we're interested. There's usually like some back and forth with the quantifier for a while before they, you know, give the final seal of approval. Grant agreement with PNC and the Corp, sub-grant agreement with the applicant. And so at that point, it's on a reimbursement basis, you know, unless, you know, we're open to if, you know, construction cost is too high for your organization to bear, maybe we can work with that. But other than that, I mean, there's a private grant, it doesn't necessarily come from red tape that most of these public grants are. So we can do pretty.
But if the money's coming to the community, they'll still need to go through their bidding processes and run it that way. TNC doesn't take that offline, right?
Correct. If you, like a public agency is gonna have to go through that bid process, TNC is not gonna require it. So.
So you've mentioned a couple times that there are only sort of a couple of projects that have been done through this. Do you think there's some hesitancy, or do you think this is more just shovel-ready projects not being there yet?
Well, part of it's just a brand new program. So our first funding round was kind of the turn of the year 2024 to 2025. We got one project funded, that was our pilot project. And then to be honest, like we've been really slow the last year because I've been spending all my time in Dartmouth. So that's real, and we're remobilizing and getting some new resources. So, but we did just get our second funding round. We funded 2 projects for $3 million. So, you know, my goal is $5 million next funding round and make that happen as soon as possible. So, but there is, you know, we're not getting a ton of projects, but we've got, like I said, a handful of these partners that realize the opportunity, know that what they're doing is competitive, and they're giving us what we need to do what we can. I could see a project development bottleneck in the future, and we're gonna get some additional resources to help.
Sweet. Well, I think if Bob Holly can hear me and you're about ready, we'll figure that out with the tech real quick. Thank you, Adam. And this is partially me talking to people in the room and talking to future people who are going to watch this on YouTube. But just because there haven't been a ton of projects with this, I'm hoping to do one about a similar roundtable about this time next year, hopefully with some people who've been through the process who can provide some more clarity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. All right, I'm sharing my screen. If I can get a thumbs up or a let me know.
Steve?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Well, you want me to just take off?
Go for it.
Okay, awesome. Well, Adam, thanks for that introduction. As Adam mentioned, we've been doing some stormwater basin retrofits for a lot of partners, but we worked with Adam back in his previous position when he was in Hamilton County, and so got a lot of different types of retrofits that we've done with Adam, and but we were asked to give this presentation on kind of why, where, and how. Okay, and so as Adam mentioned, basin retrofits, they can be a really cost-effective tool in watershed scale restoration. So you got a stream down here that's suffering from, hydrologic impairments, basically too flashy, too much erosive power. It's ripping apart the stream. And so, what we see in these developed communities is there's thousands of detention basins up in these watersheds. And so to Adam's point, you probably don't just need one or two expensive retrofits. You probably need a good concentration of retrofits in a nice sub watershed to actually realize the benefits. And we've actually been seeing that in our work. But off-channel floodplain restoration, floodplain wetlands, oxbow habitats, that can be another nice tool in the toolbox. It sounds like Adam's funded some of those. Restoration of like stream wetland complexes, and not just restoring the stream, but trying to get some wetlands constructed to hold back that flow and benefit more downstream reaches instead of just fixing the stream any certain reach. And then, low-cost stream restoration opportunities up in headwaters, so hand-placed wood structures and riparian reforestation of those water-loving trees that grow roots across the bed, like sycamores and black willows, to help, provide permanent wood structures in these streams. Those are all kind of some of the low-cost watershed scale restoration that we've been piloting in many watersheds. And we've got this guidebook that we developed with U.S. Fish and Wildlife that kind of goes into that. But today we're going to focus on the stormwater basin retrofits. And so the first question is why? So, the history of stormwater management is that it's not been protective of aquatic biodiversity. It's not consistent with the goals of the Clean Water Act. So you basically take an undeveloped watershed historically and you develop it, and the pattern up until very recently was that you very quickly lose that biological integrity that you had prior to development, especially if it was a forested watershed. And so and that's because of how we manage stormwater as civil engineers, stormwater managers. So you take that pre-developed hydrograph and you add a bunch of impervious surfaces, and you see the runoff volume and the rate of that discharge is a lot higher. It's a lot more volume. It's a lot higher than the peak discharge of the pre-developed condition, and that led to a lot of flooding. And so civil engineers said, you know, that's not good. And stormwater planners, conservation folks, this isn't good, right? To have flooding. So what we did in the kind of the 1980s to about the 2000s was we started implementing peak control detention, where we're trying to, you know, you've got extra volume running off, but you take that extra volume and you route it into a detention basin, and you don't let the peak discharge after development exceed the peak discharge pre-development. And so this was largely implemented for flood control. And what you see here is that, you know, most detention basins, even when it's raining or even when it right after a rainstorm, most detention basins are empty because those flood control detention basins, they don't really start to attenuate flow until you hit the really big storms, like the 2-year and above. And so for most storms in a typical year, stormwater comes in and it goes right out. And so in Northern Kentucky, that volume is about 3 inches. I think in Central Ohio, the 2-year storm might be a little bit less than 3 inches. But in general, you know, pretty much all the storms in a typical year are having very little attenuation. They're going kind of right through the detention basins. And so, you know, that led to things like this, where this is a developed watershed. They the industrial facilities all have detention basins, but we get 0.3 inches in an hour and the stream looks like this, right? Because those, again, the detention basins collect the stormwater, but they route it straight through. And you can imagine how much damage that caused when you hit that on repeat. You know, every time you get 0.3 inches of rain, your stream looks like this. It's not going to be the same as an undeveloped stream, where similar setting, similar size watershed, about 0.3 inches in an hour or 0.4 inches in 2 hours, and the flow looks like this. And so the question is, well, when did we take the picture? Did we miss the rain? What happened? And the answer is, we actually took the picture during peak discharge. So in a natural watershed, rain hits the leaves, hits the herbaceous layer, and hits the topsoil and slowly soaks into the topsoil, and then very gradually makes its way down to the stream. And so you see the stream rose, you know, about 3 hours after the rain, but it really didn't rise at all during the rain, right? So that's kind of how a natural watershed responds. And so, you know, and then the other thing is, you know, when we don't really treat the runoff from, you know, the initial, these smaller storms, we have what's called the first flush, where you're getting lots of stormwater pollutants that kind of go right through these detention basins and end up in our streams. And so beginning in the 2000s in different communities through about 2015 or so, folks started implementing these water quality volume criteria, where we said, well, let's take a reasonable amount of rain, so maybe the 80th or 90th percentile in a typical year, and let's make sure all of that, all of those events get routed through some sort of water quality BMP. And so, you know, for large part, you know, developers still have to do flood control, so they're still building detention basins. And so instead of a regular detention basin, you make it an extended detention basin with a sediment forebay and an underdrain release structure that, you know, slowly releases that water, makes it go through some gravel, and you get that treatment of that first flush. And, you know, you can kind of take these and make them really pretty. You can make bio-infiltration basins with lots of nice native plantings and so forth. And so that was kind of the trend in the, you know, early 2000s. But what we notice here is that we've still got this gap of storms, you know, above 0.8 inches of rain, but below 3 inches of rain. And it'll vary in Central Ohio, but you get the idea, where these storms are relatively unmanaged. And this is often where channel erosion begins. And so that brings us to the critical discharge for stream bed erosion. So this is the threshold discharge when the rocks on the bottom of the stream become entrained, they become mobilized. And so we've been studying this for a long time. It's all the way back to like the 1950s. We've got a really good handle on what flows cause erosion for different sized particles. And this is a really important flow for not only erosion, but also the bugs that live on the rocks, right? A lot of those bugs have been evolved to have life cycles that mimic the natural frequency of these of the mobilization of these rocks. And so this dashed line here on this graph represents that critical discharge for this one of the first papers on this idea back in 2002 from a Colorado study by Brian Bledsoe. And what you see is we've got this is our 2-year storm. We've got our 2-year storm without detention. We've got a 2-year storm with detention. And you see that if you look at that time and the amount of flow above that critical discharge, we have a lot more duration of those erosive flows when they occur. And then we also have a lot more frequency of erosive flows. And so conventional detention typically means more erosion than pre-developed conditions. And that can lead to stream bed deepening and widening, water quality impacts, and biological disturbance. So you start to mobilize the pebbles on the bed, and then you do that over and over, and they're not replaced by pebbles from upstream or cobbles. And you have the original stream bed, and then you have basically, you've just made the stream deeper because you mobilize the particles that were on the bed, they're gone, so the stream gets deeper. That's when you lead to head cuts and all kinds of channel degradation trajectories where you get incision, and then the banks become so tall that you have widening because of geotechnical instability, mass wasting, and it takes a very long time for a stream to recover to the point of the banks become so wide that the stream can no longer transport this material. Benches start to redevelop and they get colonized by vegetation, and you can recover to a new equilibrium. And this is a natural process, but it takes a long time. And when you've got unnatural hydrology, it can take a lot longer. And so the point of these retrofits is, let's solve the root of the problem, which is too much erosive power in our flow regime. And let's try to restrict those erosive flows and see if we can induce a geomorphic recovery. So this was the first retrofit we did with a lot of partners, including US EPA. And we basically took a 24-inch opening on a conventional detention basin, and we restricted it down to about an 8-inch opening. And we gave it this bypass so that we have similar flood control performance for the big storms, like the 100-year discharge. And here you see it in action, where it's a simple change to the outlet structure. You see the ponding just gets barely above the top of that pipe. So without the retrofit, this storm would have went right through, right through that 24-inch pipe, but that 8-inch opening restricted the discharge. So you take, and the idea here is you restrict as many flows, as many storms as feasible below that critical discharge. And you need to know what the critical discharge is for your community. We can talk about that. But for this first study, what we showed is for the pre-retrofit condition, even the 3-month and 6-month and 1-year storm, and all the way up, but even the 3-month storm was exceeding that critical discharge. And so that means, again, statistically, once every 3 months, we're hammering the pebbles on the bed, we're disturbing the macroinvertebrates, right? Post retrofit, we got the 3-month, 6-month, and 1-year storm to be released below that critical discharge. And the 2-year storm still exceeded that critical discharge. So it's back to a more natural disturbance frequency. And so here's an example of an event. We get 20 CFS coming in. That would have just ripped right through, and it's without the retrofit, we restrict it down to less than 4 CFS, leaving the detention basin. Here's some monitoring of that. We've got basically our retrofit, and we call this the spur. We've got an upstream control site where we didn't have any retrofits up here, and then we have our downstream site that combines the flows from the restricted, retrofit stream, and then the control site. And what we see is not only are we making the high flows less flashy and reduced power, we're also extending the duration of base flows. So we're prolonging the flows during dry weather as well, by not letting the water just rip right through. And so that led to fish in these pools that we had never seen fish in these pools before. So we're keeping these pools wet enough to support fish. So that's obviously an ecological lift from a a fish community standpoint. We measure the bed material, and we actually see aggradation, which means we're no longer sending the pebbles downstream, but we're actually accumulating sediment along the toes of these banks. And whereas we see continued coarsening at the upstream control site. And then pictures kind of speak 1,000 words. This is the photo of the spur looking upstream. We see bank erosion beforehand and channel widening, and then we see after the retrofit, we see vegetation of the toes of those banks and more of a low flow channel developing here. And that was our spur site. At our downstream site, we again bank erosion before the project, before the retrofit. You see this tree with exposed roots. After the retrofit, the tree no longer has exposed roots. We see this bench that's developed along the toe of that bank, and it's getting vegetated. So that's really indicative of a geomorphic recovery. Here's some, if you don't just want to believe the pictures, here's some survey data that shows, before the retrofit, we saw all this widening. After the retrofit, we see this bench development, bar development that again was colonized by vegetation. And then our upstream control site, this is looking upstream looking downstream before the retrofit. We had some benches up there before, and then after the retrofit over the same time period, we see bank erosion and no benches. So our upstream site is on that trajectory of degradation because there were no retrofits upstream. Our spur site is on a trajectory of recovery, as well as our downstream site. So we didn't retrofit the whole watershed, but we did enough over here, controlled enough of the total imperviousness for the whole watershed that even the downstream site saw benefits. So and then we get to the habitat, the RBP scores. This is before the project. This is the spur site, and this is the downstream site. After the retrofit, we have again, bank erosion is no longer an issue. We got bars developing and becoming vegetated benches, tree roots no longer exposed, and so forth. So we went from poor habitat to average habitat without doing any in-stream work, only touching the flows. So we basically induced this recovery from a degradation, down cutting and widening, back to aggradation over 4 or 5 years, and then that aggradation is stable long enough that vegetation can colonize it. So more of an equilibrium condition where we got stable vegetated benches. So that was our proof of concept, and then we've been kind of doing this on a much larger scale across different partners. But what we did for they call it the CLEB, the central, I forget, in Cleveland and the broader Cleveland area. We developed a screening tool so that other folks could help. We could help other folks do this kind of on their own. Like what are the things that we look for in a good retrofit candidate, a good candidate for detention basin retrofits? And so we did this with our partners up in Northeast Ohio, and so again, we're trying to kind of distill our experience in finding good retrofits and make it a kind of a transparent flow of logic, and really prioritize those cost-effective opportunities. And so you need some data to go into this, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to get to some of the key points here. So we got this decision tree, and the first and some of our off ramps we're trying to get to the high benefit, low cost. All right, so this first off ramp is the highest benefit, lowest cost, and it's basically I'll come back to it. But then we've got some other off ramps where it's high benefit, low cost. And then we got some very high benefit, but also high cost. So still decent on the cost effectiveness. And then we've got some kind of low to medium benefit, but medium to high cost. And that's where, you probably don't want to spend your dollars on, at least not right away. Okay. So the first question is the stormwater control basin, is it a wet basin? And if it's wet, so, everybody knows what a wet basin is, it has a permanent pool, right? If it's dry, it doesn't have a permanent pool, right? Those are the everybody knows that. So if it's wet, do you have the ability to lower the permanent pool? Okay. So here's our permanent pool, and or some people call it normal pool or whatever, but basically the elevation of the lowest orifice. So the bottom elevation of the lowest orifice, that's the permanent pool elevation. And if you have the ability to lower it, even lowering it just like a few inches can be a real benefit, and it's often imperceptible. So this was a basin I went to that was clogged. The outlet was clogged, so I unclogged it, and it dropped the water surface about 3 to 4 inches. And same picture, same vantage point. It's really tough to tell that is 3 to 4 inches lower. So even 3 to 4 inches of lowering can be a real benefit in terms of the amount of storage you can get. So if you have the ability to lower the permanent pool, well, how do we understand that? So if our outlet is a concrete channel, or our outlet is a stormwater pipe, we don't really have the ability to lower that in a cost-effective way, right? Because you'd have to replace this whole concrete channel, you'd have to replace this whole pipe, right? But if you got an outlet structure that extends below the permanent pool, and your outlet pipe is somewhere underneath this berm that's lower than the water surface, you do have the ability to lower that permanent pool. Okay, so that's, again, that's a yes. If it's a yes, evaluate simple like V-notch weir or equivalent. And so this is what we mean by V-notch weir. You're literally just cutting a little V at the bottom of the low flow outlet, right? So here's a engineering drawing exhibit that shows that, and the reason that is here's some equivalent examples. So instead of a V-notch weir, you can drill some holes in the concrete. Multiple holes kind of minimize the risk of clogging and so forth. But the reason that is like a no-brainer, as long as the folks are okay with you lowering the permanent pool elevation, is you haven't increased the risk of overtopping. You haven't really done any of the other things we're going to talk about. It's simply you've opened up more storage, more freeboard available for storage, and you've got a slow release instead of a really big open window right away, or this big window compared to just this V, right? That is kind of the simplest, lowest cost that you can find. The next question is if it's a dry basin, or if it's a wet basin, but you can't lower the permanent pool, do you have adequate freeboard to restrict the low flow outlet without grading? Okay, so one of the big questions here is about freeboard. So you've got the 100-year storm, and you've got the 100-year water surface, and you've got your top of berm. Most regions that we work in target about a 1 foot of freeboard for the 100-year. And it's not necessarily like, you have to hit it necessarily in every retrofit, but the idea is, let's say some designer had, 1.5 feet of freeboard, or 2 feet of freeboard, or even 4 feet of freeboard. You've got that ability to basically restrict smaller storms, use up some of that ponding for smaller storms, and then you've increased the freeboard during the 100-year, but you haven't increased it so much that you're kind of taking risks or going kind of above the sort of standard of care. Okay, so again, typically, most designers target 1 foot of freeboard. You have to check the rules for Central Ohio. If the drawings or stormwater calculations from a existing basin showed more than 1 foot, then you know you've got the ability to retrofit. And then, you know, we got other kind of tricks that we can get into, but I don't want to take up too much time. So the main thing here is, you know, like this one, you've got, you know, 100-year elevation is at, you know, 892.89. The top of berm is 894. So you've got an extra 0.11 feet of freeboard. That might not seem like a lot, but it could be the difference between, you know, restricting, you know, the 1-year storm below Q critical and keeping, you know, the 3-month storm and exceeding Q critical and so forth. So you can often gain a lot by just a little bit of freeboard. So let's see. Again, kind of reviewing drawings. There's going to be some basins where there's no freeboard or negative freeboard. Okay, where the 100-year already overtops the spillway. Okay, and then there's other basins where you're going to have freeboard to work with. So that's a real quick, easy screening that helps you understand, do I have kind of a low cost here or a potentially high cost where I've got to grade it bigger. This is one thing that we often use when we're looking at potential candidates, and it really varies by community. So what you're looking at for kind of low cost retrofits typically are the stormwater basins that were built that had flood control, but probably didn't have like water quality or more modern flood control. And so depending on when the rules and regs were rolled out in your community, you kind of figure out when that was and then target when did the imperviousness that pop up here in the national layers, right? And if you know the development went in at a certain time, then you can kind of quickly know, okay, this is the neighborhood or these are the general regions within our community that are likely to have these basins that are probably not doing enough to restrict erosive flows, but also at least have flood control criteria and are big enough to potentially restrict more flows. I'm going to skip this. It's a little trick, but we're running out of time. But one thing I really wanted to cover was if you don't have enough freeboard, the next question is there a suitable engineering spillway? And figuring out what the downstream risks are. And so what we're getting at here is, you know, here's an engineered spillway, right? It's got armor, it's got protected banks. This is a spillway that's designed, but it just has grass, right? So this spillway can handle some pretty intense flows. This spillway can handle more of a trickle, more of a, you know, just a little bit of depth going over this spillway. And it's berm, so it's clearly made of fill, right? So you really don't want to send a lot of extra water over a berm like this versus an armored spillway like this. Some other things like you'll see this one has an armored spillway, but it's not in good shape. The downstream end of it ties into a stream that's totally eroded. And so, you know, this has some issues that needs to be addressed, but it's not going to be a low cost retrofit. And it's probably got to be addressed by the basin owner already. And then, you know, here's an example of, you know, no apparent spillway in the aerial. And then you gotta consider, I'm putting my safety hat on here, but if it does go over the spillway, where does the water go? And so look, in this case, it goes over a road and then it aims right at a residence, right? In this case, it goes over a road, right? In this case, it goes over a fill slope, and this fill slope's pretty steep, and so that's not a good thing, right? So, but if it's more of a sunken depression, and the spillway, there's no spillway, but it's just kind of a pond that continues to kind of flow out. It's not really like a classic berm. That's a lower risk situation, right? So you just want to think about where does that water go if it does have to go over the spillway. All right, so yeah, and then so if it has a suitable engineered spillway or adequate freeboard, then you evaluate the simple things that Adam showed earlier, where plates to low flow plate around the low flow outlet and maybe some plates on some of the windows. In this case, we extended the riser because we had more freeboard for this basin. And, this is our first one. We call it the Detain H2O, a pipe insert. But anyway, very low cost to get at our goals of restricting as many flows as possible below that critical discharge. And then the last kind of decision point in this is it a large basin that intercepts a large amount of the watershed's impervious area? And so here's an example that we found in Northeast Ohio when we were working with those partners. And this basin intercepted 32% of the imperviousness and 72% of the total imperviousness of the watershed and 65% of the total drainage area of the watershed. And so this is not a low cost retrofit, but because it intercepts so much flow, it would be a good candidate for one of those more expensive real-time control structures that Adam was saying. It might cost $200,000, but it's better than retrofitting 20 low cost basins, right? Anyway, that's where it does make sense. Like, it is high cost, but it's a very high benefit relative to the scale of the watershed. All right, so again, real-time control could be super high cost to multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some other kind of higher costs, but not on the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but basically, adding under drains with a lot of gravel, adding new outlet control structures and doing more grading. All of those things can add cost compared to the simple retrofits, but they might be worth it if it's a basin that intercepts a lot of your area draining to your stream. And then if you did all this work and you found out that it's kind of it doesn't check any of these boxes, it's basically a kind of a low medium benefit with a medium to high cost, we just catalog those for later. It's not like you give up on them, especially if you got a really eager property owner, or if it's like the last peg in the puzzle for a pilot watershed. Maybe it's worth spending $80,000 to expand the footprint, right, and finish out your pilot watershed. All right, so I think I'm running out of time, but one thing to keep in mind, and basically lessons that we've learned from a lot of implementation, is that you're going to have to figure out the magic number in Central Ohio by kind of trial and error. But what we found is that if we can effectively manage 25 to 50% of the impervious area in a developed watershed, we are seeing those geomorphic recoveries. And so it might be different in Central Ohio. It might depend on the timing of development and so forth. But that's kind of a good target, when you're kind of mapping out planning. And it's going to vary by community. But as far as the how, when you did the screening in the office, then you need to visit the basins, and then you ultimately need to perform modeling and develop designs. And so, here's some examples of kind of those field visits to measure the outlets, measure the inverts, and get the field data, check the this is kind of a field data form that we got, but then kind of taking the data and also looking for issues. This is an example where we got a lot of scour right here at the outlet. So, if we're going to be out there anyway, maybe we address that outlet. You see a head cut up here that's undermined this outlet. So maybe we add some rock as a part of the project to kind of head off future issues. The existing drawings, if you got a partner who reviews a lot of the stormwater detention basin plans, like a conservation district, and they've got them in-house, those can really come in handy and speed you up. As far as, what were the initial calculations and freeboards associated with those basins. And then ultimately you need to model and see how many flows can you restrict below Q critical, and what can we get with the V-notch weir, how deep does it need to be, how big does it need to be, what windows do we need to plate, and so forth. But here's what I wanted to end on. The general goal, especially if stream erosion is your problem, which I know in Central Ohio it is, and a lot of streams. The idea is restrict as many design storms as feasible to be less than that critical discharge. Critical discharge varies by region. It can even vary within a region depending on the stream bed. But in general, we've worked in several communities. Here's 2 examples where in Northern Kentucky, the critical discharge, kind of a regional representative critical discharge, is about 40 to 50% of the 2-year discharge, the undeveloped 2-year discharge. Whereas in Austin, a lot smaller gravels down there in those streams, it's more like 2% of the 2-year discharge. And turning that into a rules and regs for like target on new detention, what we say is do stormwater flood control, do the water quality you already have to do, but then take every storm up to and including the 2-year storm and make sure it's released below this critical discharge. If you do that, you get the same erosive power on a cumulative sense that you would have had under pre-developed conditions. In Austin, it's different. You take this 2-month storm and you release that below the critical discharge, which is 2% of the 2-year storm, the 2-year peak discharge. And you also do the rules and regs related to flood control and water quality. So you do that and you get the same erosive power that you had before development. So in Central Ohio, I expect it's going to be closer to the Northern Kentucky. And then if you're retrofitting and you can get more than the 2-year, get it, right? We've got some basins where we can take the 100-year and get it to be released less than Q critical. And the idea there is, no, that's not natural, but you're trying to sort of get whatever you can from the basins you're retrofitting, because you can't get to every basin, or there's some imperviousness out there that you can't intercept, right? So you're trying to over control in the basins that you have the ability to do that, so that you can compensate in the aggregate for some of those harder to retrofit impervious areas. So again, kind of one piece in the watershed scale restoration, but that is what we have. And no matter what you do, I recommend piloting it and then monitoring it and assessing it, even if it's as simple as a photo from the same spot. So you can tell visually if this is inducing a geomorphic recovery or if the banks continue to fail and look like this, right? So those are some of the lessons we've got. And if we have time for questions, I'm happy to take them.
Do we have any questions from anybody in the room or online? None. I'm going to make sure internet is working. Can you hear us all right, Bob?
Yes.
Okay. All right, then if we don't have any questions on Bob's presentation, thank you. We've heard a little bit about basin retrofits, how they work, how to identify them, their benefits for streams and other natural environments. And then we've heard about some new opportunities for funding these. So I'm not sure people needed much convincing on basin retrofits or restoration projects, but we'll hear a little bit from Kyle on how to sell it to governmental partners and the community.
Pull up the Crawford Farms if you don't mind first. Do we have a clicker that's working?
Vaguely. Just point at the screen.
Point at the screen. All right. It says Kurt Kellyo up here. I'm not Kurt Kellyo. I am Kyle Wilson, Assistant Director here at Franklin Soil and Water. I've got over 20 years experience in not necessarily developing the projects like what Bob just showed you, but really being the one that implements those projects, right? So from my perspective, one thing that whether it's Mark or a consultant like mad scientist coming into a community and needing to sell the value of a project that they want to do, or someone like Luke at Rapid 5 selling a project to the broader community, getting that buy-in. There's always things that we have to do as implementers that are a little unexpected on building consensus and getting that full buy-in. One of the stories I tell is about our 200-acre stream and wetland project at Hell Ranch Meadows. You look at it now, and it's a great project. It's got thousands of linear feet of main stream tributary and headwater streams that were restored, acres of wetlands, hundreds of acres of prairie. And you think, hey, this was a great success. We owned that property fee simple. We had complete control over it. We had funding in place. We still had to sit in front of public meetings at Prairie Township where residents came in and literally were yelling about us doing that project and what the construction was going to do and what it was going to be like during construction and the nuisance wildlife that was going to bring on and things like that. And now sitting back years later after that restoration, we hear from the community all the time how great that was and what a resource it is for the community now. But we had to go through that. And that's the case really with all of our projects. So today we're going to take a look at a couple of our past projects. One, Crawford Farms, that was a stormwater retrofit, much in line with the concepts that Bob Holly was just talking about. It's about 10 years old, maybe a little more now. And then we'll look at a more recent project, Fieldstone. It's a stream restoration. And we'll just talk a little bit about some of the hurdles that we had to go through in actually getting those on the ground that we want people thinking about, because it's not the biggest obstacle, right? Adam maybe spoke on the biggest obstacle, finding the money to do these projects, right? Bob talked about then what has to go into making sure they're worthwhile and making sure they're smart and appropriate for that concept. So those are probably the biggest hurdles, but we can't ignore the fact that we also have to get the consensus and buy-in to get these done, right? So I will run through these presentations pretty quick because they've got a lot of data in them. But this was a retrofit of a detention basin. You can see pre-development, it was just kind of out in this agricultural field, most likely, wetland soils, very traditional detention basin. Was developed. So we were designing back then for water quantity, right? We didn't care about quality. Who cares about fish and bugs and what goes on downstream? There were a couple inlets to this basin. During low flow, these concrete channels essentially delivered groundwater and any small events straight into these concrete channels and straight out the basin. So really, in all but our larger storm events, like what Bob pointed out earlier, this basin was effectively doing nothing for water quality or water quantity, right? So we started looking at it and saying, okay, you know, what can we do here? Well, we've got a park setting, we've got little playground and things, and then this is the open space for the community kind of around it. So we started talking about what could be done to improve it. Well, you know, we had some hurdles to overcome, right? We had Columbus Parks and Recreation, who were operating this park as they have for many years, right? And so they were reluctant to change, all right? If I'm out here in the basin area, which is kind of all of this out here, you know, what's that maintenance going to look like now? Before they just came in and mowed it, right? The folks who have to take care of the infrastructure, they were looking at it and they're just like, well, we've just got a pipe to come down, we've got an inlet. What's the new basin going to look like? What type of maintenance schedules are we going to be on? So we had to start thinking, all right, how do we sell this project to the community that currently control the city of Columbus? And what we started talking about was just kind of switching the framing of this from we're just working on a stormwater project. So let's help make an amenity for this community, right? So again, the previous condition was just this channel that went from inlet to outlet. And then it was a weedy, muddy patch of the rest of the basin. They could maybe mow it 2 or 3 times a year. So it wasn't looking manicured or intentional. It was kind of just weeds, and then when it got dry enough that they could get a zero turn across it, they would. The stories from the maintenance teams is about once a year, they were stuck in there, had to get in and pull people out, created ruts. It added to the mosquito problem. So all in all, this really wasn't working for anyone, right? So we started talking to them, thinking about design, thinking about what would be best for Dysart Run. This is a tributary out in the Reynoldsburg area that literally has had houses condemned because of downstream erosion. Banks failing and houses being unsafe to live in. So there was a lot of work to do. Sorry, I have a problem. So we wanted to treat stormwater, we wanted to slow stormwater, reduce the volume, create more attractive area for the park. So we started putting together all these goals for alignment in this project. And what we came up for design was essentially a design that would renaturalize the area while both increasing our quantity that we could store there, but also working on that quality. So instead of, again, having an inlet going straight to the outlet, we created this design where the initial flush would dump into a micro pool that City of Columbus could then put on a maintenance schedule for all your sediments and things that you don't want ultimately leaving this site eventually. So it exists in a 4-bay and a micro pool there. Then we created berms to create the flow pattern differently in this basin. So instead of that maybe 75-foot direct to the outlet channel, we now have a routing of this basin that goes around these berms through vegetation and then ultimately back into a micro pool before the outlet. And what we found with this was because of this sinuous path to the outlet, much of our rain events never leave this site now. So all the groundwater coming from sump pumps and things like that are still running this time of year, those are going into the 4-bay and eventually infiltrating before they get in. Even our smaller storms will never reach that outlet. So we're still getting all that capacity in the big events. So now this fills up and actually has more storage volume in the past. But the real benefit of it is that it's infiltrating a lot of the flows and are no longer impacting downstream. On top of that, we started working into the design, kind of, again, that amenity of instead of just a grassy, weedy patch, we can create something different here. And I'll probably skip through a lot of these slides of construction and things, but you can kind of just see what the project looked like as it was getting placed in there and some of that routing.
It took a lot of
Sure
pictures.
takes a lot of pictures. We deleted a lot of pictures over the years, but they're still in. So there's the, I can get back to it. There's the basin now at kind of that capacity. Again, you're seeing a lot of vegetation sticking out. Those are the berms that run around and create those low flow patterns. And then in these big events, probably a 2-year, 5-year event, you're going to start seeing more of this ponding here and then that slower release. But then we came in and started making it, prettier essentially, right? To us, it's providing ecological lift to the residents that live around there that don't know any better. Hey, we've got flowers and pollinators and insects and things like that. Kids can go capture frogs and things like that. So just clicking through a few more of these, we'll have some photos of what it looks like at the end here eventually. Here's our lessons learned from that project. But here's one photo from the end, right? So now, if you looked at this and you didn't know the setting or anything, the first thing that comes to your mind isn't a detention pond anymore, right? We don't see this mowed landscape. We don't see the tracks from the mowing. We don't see the trash that accumulates in there now. If you look at this, you could be driving by Patel Darby Metro Park or something like that, right? A lot of prairie plants, a lot of tree planting, flowering, pollinator type friendly plants. And really, now the park looks at it as an extension of what they had there before, right? They had a playground, they had all this, Well, now they're providing a natural space for these residents. And it's something that they can now look at and enjoy. Again, here's that forebay that's outletting to it. And they can enjoy this area, and those residents in that specific subdivision now have a natural space that they never had before, right? It's not just a mowed open space. So again, on this Oak Ranch or on this Crawford Farms, and Annabelle, you can switch over to the Fieldstone project while I'm talking. Again, the people we had to convince about this one were less the residents around it, right? We had to talk to them about, okay, what we're doing, is it going to increase the mosquito population? We pointed to data that says, you know, if you have natural habitats and you bring in the insects and everything else, you're going to reduce that mosquito pressure as opposed to the ruts and things that are sitting there, right? So we didn't have a lot to do in terms of getting the residents on board, but being 10 years ago, that project, the Crawford Farm Retrofit Project, it really took us a ton of time convincing the city of Columbus, right? And for two reasons. One, we had to convince them that we could make a design that, even though it currently didn't fit the stormwater manual, that it wouldn't negatively impact that. And then we had to really spend a lot of time with them on the maintenance side of things, all right? Here's what your structure is going to look like. Here's the specs for maintenance. Comparing that to what was typically there and saying, yes, you may have to do this a little differently, but we're not asking you to do anything above and beyond what you're already doing. Oh, and you don't have to mow this and get your equipment stuck and things like that. We want to still be very intentional with those basins, mowing buffers and keeping invasives out and keeping it looking good. But overall, from Columbus Parks and Rec, they had a reduction in maintenance. And then we kept it even with the facilities folks, DPU and the who actually do the maintenance on the outfalls. We kept their work even. So that was one where we had to sell it to the community. This next one is one that we had to sell it, municipality on that first one. The next one is the one that we had to sell this one more to the residents who live around it, right? And now a year after install of this project, these folks think it's great, but we'll kind of tick through the reasons why they were reluctant. So this is our Fieldstone stream restoration project. Again, we're zooming into the Blacklead Creek here. Fieldstone is probably a 20-year-old subdivision or so. Originally had this, again, Franklin County. We have streams that were widened and deepened for agricultural ditches. We needed to move water off the land, which was no exception. But then again, in modern times, a scenario that we see hundreds of places throughout Franklin County, you now have these streams incorporated into a development, and there's issues that are going to arise over time with that, right? The main issue on this one was these houses to the south were getting flooded. The stream was seeing erosion, and the residents were actually taking matters into their own hands. They were hired a contractor to come in and clear all the vegetation along that stream at one point, even though it was owned by Jefferson Township and not even private property. So we came in and we started looking at things, and we said, okay, well, if flooding on the southern parcels is a big issue, and we're seeing erosion from the flashiness upstream, what are some solutions we can come up with? And originally we looked at this project for a wetland treatment train and things, but funding dictated other. So we looked and we said, all right, restore the floodplain, get more storage for the storms on site that is away from the residences here, and then do stream channel improvements that will essentially reduce that erosion on site and slow water downstream. So we started looking at this and saying, all right, we've got an idea for this restoration. Jefferson Township, our partner on this, completely on board, 319 on board. Now, as we started to go in and talk to the residents, they kept pushing back, right? And we couldn't figure out exactly why at first, but what it boiled down to is no one likes change, no matter if that change has a lot of good for it, right? And what a lot of these residents were worried about was, one, that we were gonna make things worse, right? That's always the initial problem. Is that you've got to solve for is, hey, prove to me that if you're making more floodplain, that doesn't just mean more floodplains coming towards my property and my house. So that's pretty easy in design, right? We go through that, we model things. It's simple enough to share plans and talk them through it and alleviate that. The next big hurdle we had to get on over on this particular site was they really thought it was going to impact how the community used the area. They were very concerned that currently, it being a Jefferson Township parcel, a lot of the residents' kids went on and played soccer and things like that. And they were just adamant that we were going to come in, replant this whole thing, and there was going to be no open space recreation for the residents anymore. So again, it was just a communication and outreach to the residents saying, hey, here's the design. Yes, we are going to spoil material in certain places because we've got to excavate a lot of floodplain. Here's where it's going to go, though. This is what it's going to look like afterwards. And then also, we hear you. We're going to leave this area where the kids are playing soccer and doing this, that, and the other completely untouched so that we don't even have to worry about messing that up for you and kind of getting through those hurdles. So with that, we were able to come up with a design, again, moving the channel as far as we could under the budget constraints we had. We moved the channel away from the houses. We created floodplain and we staggered it essentially to be away from the houses as much as we could so that we're moving and shifting that high flood water. These folks are still going to see that in the largest events, but it's going to minimize that. And then we came up with a design that obviously had a river pool run design and created a lot more stability here. So we're not going in with that long-term instability that the residents see as erosion and a big problem. We're fixing that for them. On top of that, again, all of our projects, we put in a lot of thought of, if we're dealing with a restoration site that's 200-300 acres, we want that natural, right? We want that, basically you might have access for some fire breaks or an access point where you park and things like that. But other than that, we want that whole site going natural, right? In instances like this, we know we have to be more intentional with our design. We have to allow mowing in certain areas so that it can keep appearances. We even made exceptions, and there's Henry who ran this project. We even made exceptions to allow mowing to go down to the stream in certain areas, right? So that we can allow access to some of the riffles. The kids can get in there now. They can cross this. Because of the new design, it's a much narrower channel and lower depths through our riffles and pools. They can walk across this now. The kids can be in it. They used to, a lot of the residents, even though it wasn't their property, their solution was to build bridges across this in the past. There's no need for that now. In low flows, we've made it accessible and they can get across in certain points. So, again, as Adam creates funding opportunities, as Clean Ohio, continues to have a lot of success for acquisition and restoration, 319, all these other grants, it's a little less and less our hurdle just being funding, right? So we have to think about how we can sell these projects as amenities. One of the big stream restorations, and my clicker's not working anymore, but one of the big stream restorations in Hilliard, Clover Draw runs along there. That was a ditch, much like any of the other ditches out there 20 plus years ago. And millions of dollars have been spent in that watershed alone to restore Clover Draw, right? One of the sections is Spindler Franks Park, City of Columbus, Parks and Rec. They did thousands of feet of restoration through there. In conjunction with that, they acquired a lot of land to do that project, right? So now we're looking back 20 years later, and some of the criticism in that watershed in particular is well, these streams aren't performing exactly like we had anticipated or what was sold, right? We were told, all right, we're going to build these streams doing natural channel design. They're going to function as streams, right? Well, now 20 years later, we know that there's not a lot of velocity going through there due to the flatness of that area. And a lot of these riffles are filling in, right? So that they might be there, but they could be buried in some substrate. And so some people are looking at those projects based solely on that QHEI outcome or other parameters, and they're saying, well, maybe this project wasn't a complete success, right? But if you go out there now and walk that area and you kind of look at the stream corridor of how it's changed, and now we've got buffers on each side of hundreds of feet in most areas. The vegetation is now maturing, and you've got 20-foot tall trees shading clover growth. You've got riffles and pools, even though some of them might be sediment laden. But you've also got this natural area that thousands of people a day are now using, right? It's got multi-use bike path going up and down. It's got access from different communities where they can, now on foot or on bike, get to these natural spaces within a couple of minutes walking instead of loading into their car and driving to the metro park. So I think, looking at it, our restoration work and our retrofit work, yeah, we're the nerds that are going to look at water quality and bugs and fish and things like that, and that's going to move us. But we really have to start getting beyond that for the general public, and quite frankly, for the folks we're going to have to work with to get these in, right? The engineer at City of Columbus or the maintenance guy or things like that, they just want to do their job, and they've been doing it a certain way. We've got to find ways to communicate what needs done and why, and get that buy-in from all these different stakeholders in order to get more and more of these on the ground. So that's my spiel. Any questions on kind of hurdles or importance of community or stakeholder engagement or anything like that?
I was curious if this were done with funding related to the volumetric water benefit. Would the calculated benefit be the full volume that passes through that stream length post restoration on an annualized basis, or how is that calculated?
It's all annualized. Stream restoration is like the one obvious glaring thing that is not in the volumetric benefit accounting document. We could probably do it. What we have to do is sell it to one of the third-party quantifiers, like a Limitech. They want real simple stuff. And so one of the things I've been kicking around a lot is trying to sell is from like a stream bank stabilization standpoint. And if you look at like the Steppel or Plett method of looking at like bank receivings, I think that's one way to sell it. Other than that, it's real complicated trying to model this.
What about if you're creating floodplain wetlands? Could you get the storage in those
Yeah,
wetlands?
wetlands are different. So
Yeah.
off-channel wetlands, I was just talking
So-
about that, right?
so that might be
Flood waters are huge.
Yeah, so even though we're not in a stream restoration, obviously, we're looking at habitat and other functions of that restored stream. Maybe for specific, that funding source, Hell Branch Meadows is a good example. In our funding, we use WRSP for the bulk of the restoration out there, right? And we only claimed that we were going to restore 6 or 7, 8 acres of wetland. And we identified those as our upland wetlands, right? And that got us to the funding parameters that we needed, along with the stream restoration and everything else that made the EPA satisfied. But then once we got into design, we were excavating this massive floodplain. We said, all right, let's just put a slope to this floodplain. We've got the soil types, we've got everything else. And if you went out there now and delineated wetlands in our floodplain, you'd probably get an additional 20, 30 acres of wetlands that we could have talked to the project originally in funding. So I think that's one design element that if you're specifically going for the volumetric increases and calculations, I think that floodplain, restored wetlands in the floodplain is your way to do it. Yeah.
Or even just floodplains, straight up floodplains. Maybe they're not wetlands, but floodplains that are accessible.
Right.
Have volumetric water benefits.
And how frequently they don't get into that floodplain currently.
Right.
Again, our Hell Branch Meadows site, that thing probably, Hell Branch was ditched so much that it was, trapezoidal shape, over deep, over wide, right? Anywhere along that, you just step in and sink to your thigh and set it. That could probably definitely contain a 5-year event within it. It could probably have gotten close on our property to containing the 10-year. And we created that floodplain out there now, and a 1 and 2 year event are getting on the floodplain. So yeah, if you have a site like that where you can calculate, hey, this is how much we're getting on there, and we're doing it 8 times a year rather than once every 5 years or something, I think you could get to some of those calculations.
You got a question?
I have a question.
Go please.
Well, the rainwater manual talks about like the capital recreational aesthetic value to stream restoration and natural drainage areas. You've demonstrated several projects that show that. Now we've got funding sources. Yet, like in my universe, everything is in a cultural engineering and development cultural sense is still, I want squares of
That's right.
turf grass. I get residents wanting to change BMPs because mosquitoes and they're wet and they're water. So how do we quantify all this to change that culture?
Well, again, we point to research that balanced ecosystems have less mosquito pressure and things like that, right? But again, I think with the engineering side of things, you've got to still just say focus on the numbers, right? The engineers care about X quantity. They care about stability, whatever it is. So let them get there, right? And say, all right, well, what do you need in this project to be there? And then a lot of that, even if you're not changing any of the design or finding a compromise in that, it's just plantings. It's just intentionality with the mowing schedules and things like that. Because at the end of the day, if it's a municipal project, they're not going to go below those calculations for safety and quantity and things like that. So you do have to kind of start there. But again, with this City of Columbus project and Crawford Farm being about 10 years old, that was months in their process, right? We would send them a preliminary design. They point to the manual 6 ways and say, it doesn't meet this. All right, well, what if we did this? And we went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But once that got done, even before City of Columbus's new regulations updates and things like that, then the city was finding ways to get them through much quicker. And so it's kind of just whether you're working with a new municipality or engineer or anything like that, it's going through the process on one, proving that the things you're designing for and wanting to include in their projects aren't going to be of a negative impact to it. And if you can get that established once, they'll start seeking out ways to do it a little bit. I don't know if that answered your question exactly, but the engineering does still have to stay to the standards, right?
Can we show, because the most important number is loan balance from it. Can we show that these things could be done? Not retrofit, but from the onset.
From the onset.
For the same cost.
So that's one thing, and we haven't been able to crack it yet on a wide scale. We've been able to do it with some developers, right? Is we've started talking about all the things that they're required to do, trying to make those built into their communities as an asset. One example is in Hilliard again, we've got a subdivision that on Clover Draw headwaters, they were required to do a restoration, right? As part of the development process, they wanted to shrink the floodplain a little bit. EPA and Army Corps come back and say, all right, this area needs some sort of restoration. And when you do that restoration, you're also going to need a conservation easement, right? So they used Dan Mecklenburg design, headwater stream over wide. They worked with us to do the conservation easement. And what they did to recoup some of that money that they were required to spend is they upsold every parcel around that conservation easement and restoration site as backyard adjacent to natural area, right? So now they're getting, instead of each lot being at the time, let's say $20,000, they were selling each of those lots for $60,000. So they, this was Rockford Homes, they basically told us they made money by being required to do a restoration in their development. So I think, Justin, it's the same process. It's, hey, as we're very early in these preliminary designs, we're seeing that you just have a traditional basin here, here, and here. Could we incorporate some of these other components in a way that you're now selling to your potential buyers, that you have these naturalized areas, these green areas, these things that just aren't that traditional. But it's got to happen very early in the development process, and that's where we usually, by the time we see it, those designs aren't there, and then you've got money to recorrect that. So over time, can we change that? Hopefully, but I think most of us who deal with that know that we haven't cracked that completely.
I have one in the chat. This will probably be the last question, and then we can have folks get some lunch. This was directed at Kyle, but I think some other folks in the audience might have some input on this as well. Laura Fay asked, what projects would you recommend for infiltration or groundwater restoration? I know we've got some other folks in here too who might have some input, so feel free to jump in wherever you'd like.
So again, like Crawford Farms, the more you can, get that retention time and infiltration time into your projects, I think that's a big one, right? Because like Bob pointed out, and others have pointed out, a lot of those lower flow events are what cause a lot of our stream erosion, right? It's not necessarily the ones we think of, the 5 inches in a day and a half that do the most of the damage, right? It's those smaller events. So capturing those and retaining them on site and allowing that infiltration is going to do a bulk of that work. The other thing that we're getting more and more emphasis on is what Mark was mentioning and what was mentioned earlier with offline wetlands, is that floodplain restoration. We're seeing a lot there, that you get all the benefits, as a stream restoration, but you're not having those impacts for doing the full scale restoration, where you're removing all the mature trees, or you're going in and having to spend a lot on substrate and things like that. So really, infiltration and storage, those are the things that, whatever the project type is, that's what we're kind of leaning to and emphasizing.
I just add to that, I think it's important to not focus on infiltration. And we don't have a lot of soils that do well with that, but what you're saying probably is more just in line with general abstraction, like you said.
Yeah.
You get wetland-ish soils, and you've got storage, you've got transpiration and just uptake there, and all of a sudden you can subtract off, look at curve numbers. So, a lot of those low events, probably not truly infiltrating the subsoil, but you're losing runoff, which is the key part. So, yeah, I think little things like that go a long way.
Yeah, I was thinking about your idea, or you were talking about communication.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of elected officials are there, and most of the things that they hear are, I need this. They always have to solve a problem, right? So a lot of people come and present them with work to do. And I think if we're going to be successful in this endeavor, we have to provide solutions to them. And then they'll be much more receptive to it. Doesn't mean that they're going to be open to like change, right? Everybody's scared of change. But I do think that there's gonna be less reluctance to do something if something makes sense to them. If it's not necessarily gonna cost them or their constituents more. I think that when there's new development occurring, that the developer themselves needs to have a plan, that they know going into it, that they have to do these specific items. And I think that that is going to be part of the long-term solution to this, right? The other thing, though, I was thinking about is this idea of infiltration. And we do have an incredible amount of, unfriendly soils that will, generally accept, infiltration where that aquifer is getting recharged. One of the things that I'm thinking about long term is some point in time, we're gonna have more and more groundwater extraction going on. When that happens, from my time being out in California, if everyone knows the Central Valley, where a lot of our agriculture comes from, our produce, it has actually subsided so drastically from the amount of groundwater being extracted from it that it's never going to be able to store the same amount of water as it once did. I can see that happening here or anywhere for that matter, and we'll never be able to get back that storage capacity. And then that's a lost resource that we have. That's a lost bank that we can have for groundwater. And so we have a lot of hydrological challenges associated with everything that we're trying to do, but it seems like they're all kind of focused on something that if we play the cards right, we have some examples that we can show people, and there's more and more opportunities for funding that we very well will be able to do some really good work. But it's that communication part that I think is often overlooked because we focus on the actual implementation of stuff, which is really, really important. How do you get people to say, yeah, let's try that?
And again, the biggest struggle we have is we're trying to correct things that were done 30 plus years. Our current standards and everything, we're getting. And we still have a long way to go to getting developers to see the incentive to do more than what the permit requires, right? But at least with the permits right now, we have the ability to at least get these minimal controls on there. But now it's moving that needle of like, all right, well, yes, you're meeting the minimum requirements, but how can we get you to go here? How do we incentivize? What do we need to show you in order for you to make those extra investments on the site rather than just do it?
Yeah, and the other part to it is that like, it's like when you look at a traditional site design, it's like, well, right here seems like a good spot for a retention basin. It's almost like that the idea of stormwater management has to be just as a priority as where the houses are gonna go in order for it to function in a way that seems natural. And I think that that's it, as much as using natural open space for the advantage of filtration and so forth. So there's a lot of different things that seem to happen.
And so Justin and Mark and others who have worked in Franklin County for decades, it's a strange time for us because what we preached till this point in history is Central Ohio has an abundance of fresh water, right? Both surface water and groundwater. And we trumpeted that to corporations like Budweiser. That's why they're here, right? And that's why the Intels of the world and others started moving here. Well, now for the first time in Central Ohio's history, we're starting to work. Do we really have all the groundwater that's needed? Do we really have the surface water resources protected? And it's a very different climate that we're in now than we were 5 years ago with data centers and as they moved in. So it's folks like the ones attending this workshop that have to start setting that bar a little higher and say, hey, maybe the permit isn't the end here. What can we do?
And it's not just like the idea of extracting the groundwater for like, industrial uses or whatever. It's also the fact that like groundwater often is part of the charging of our natural systems. And if you start taking that out of the ground, then there's going to be less of that available for those systems, which is cold, which helps obviously support a lot of the biological diversity. So there's a whole network of
Yeah, our site on Hell Branch is a receiving stream.
Yeah.
So it relies on that.
I think Adam's got one.
I got a question I wanted to ask Bob if he still has access to his mic. It's been a while since he was online. Hey, I stopped. Come on, cool. So, you know, I had the good experience of getting to work with Bob on a bunch of retrofits in Southwest Ohio. And the benefit of that was, you know, Bob mentioned the numbers for what Q critical was in Northern Kentucky, and I was right across the river. So we could just go with that. But, you know, coming up to Central Ohio, I'm not, you know, familiar with what, you know, I have no clue what Q critical might be, how far off it might be. We saw some wildly different numbers in Texas. I assume it's nowhere near that. But I know you've worked in Northeast Ohio, you've worked in different parts of the state. Do you feel like these projects need to have geomorphic surveys done, or do you feel like you got kind of pretty good handle on the general magnitude from your other work?
It's a great question, Adam. I mean, what we don't want to do is be wildly off, and then we restricted our discharge to a flow that is still moving a lot of sediment, right? So and when I say sediment, I mean, you know, the actual gravels and cobbles that make up the bed, not the silts and things. But I would recommend at least, you know, a couple representative streams getting geomorphic surveys where you have, you know, cross-section profile and pebble counts to just make sure that we have you know, make sure we have the right ballpark, and, you know, then you could start piloting. I mean, we've seen in Summit County, I think it was the regional Q critical was, I think it was around 40% of the 2-year. Summit's northeast of you, that was from 8 surveys. I'm going from memory, so I might be a little off on if it was exactly 40%, but I'm pretty sure it was. So if we've got Cincinnati at, you know, 40%, we've got Summit County at 40% of the undeveloped 2-year peak discharge. You know, Columbus, that would be my starting, that would be my prior, but I'd like to at least see some pictures of the bed material, and even better, some surveys, just to make sure we're not way off.
I'm just thinking about how folks can, you know, prepare to get a proposal in to get funding for this. And, you know, I'm just wondering, like, if those geomorphic surveys were part of a proposal, right? So we need funding to get that work done. Is not having that survey up front, like, are you still going to be able to provide cost estimates, or is that going to severely limit your, you know, ability to have confidence in those cost estimates?
I don't know the answer without, I at least need to see a pic, like when you all trounced around central, you know, Ohio streams, when you're in a riffle, is the bed material kind of coarse gravels that you can fit your hand around? Is it cobbles that are big enough, you know, that you can't fit your hand around, but you can pick them up? Or is it closer to like small gravels and like almost sand, right? I imagine it's like coarse gravel, but I don't know for sure.
Depends on what part of the county you're in. Essentially, if you drew a dividing line kind of through City of Columbus proper, and you said east, so Black Lake, Big Walnut, things like that, I think you're getting more into the cobble because we have stream power a little more in those. If you come far west into our tributaries, the Hell Branch Run and the Darby, you've got very low gradient stuff there that's not moving to the larger stuff.
And then is it the whole valleys are loaded with seams of gravel because of the glaciers, or is it just a little bit of bed material in the streams? And if you actually, you know, dig in the floodplain, there's not a lot of gravel over there.
I think you've got pretty consistent gravel
Okay.
in most of our watersheds. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Which
I
was-
would guess, I would guess that it would probably be in that 40% range. But it would be great if I could see a picture with somebody's boot in it for scale, just to make sure.
Just kind of connecting dots here, I think might be familiar with the EPA's 401 groups, OSAM, Ohio Stream Assessment Method Project there. For calculation of 401 mitigation. You know, part of that curve development, you know, we're looking at 90-something streams, surveying 90-something reference streams across the state. Right now, most of those have pebble counts and profile and cross-section data. Is that? I know you have to see the data. Would that be enough, at least to start, to be able to start assembling maybe more statewide or regional values?
Yes, and especially if it truly is like a riffle profile. Yeah, you know, we did some work in one of the towns with Kurt Kellyo, and I want to say it was in the 40% range. So I would go with that unless you hear otherwise from me. I'm going to try to dig that up and make sure.
Awesome. Last call. All right. I want to thank Brooke, Kyle, and Trisha in our office for helping me get through my first roundtable. I was really nervous, and I think it went pretty well. Thank you. I'd also really love to thank Adam and Bob and Kyle for sharing some of their knowledge with us today. You're all awesome folks. I'm glad you were able to be here. I'd like to thank all of you for showing up, and especially folks like Chelsea and Rachel and Mike, who were kind of specifically invited to be here. I was glad to see your faces in the audience. If you have suggestions on topics you would like to see for these roundtables, a little bit more focused. I know Lori does, she put something in the chat, but a little bit more focused on stormwater rather than restoration and stuff like that. Let me know if there are specific topics you'd like to see in our urban review newsletter. Let me know. If you'd like to chat about restoration and retrofit projects and some of the stuff I have up my sleeve, come find me and get a card. And for now, there's pizza in the lunchroom. You guys are welcome to hang out as long as you want. I don't think we have much scheduled in here for the rest of the day, but thank you.
Or unfortunately, we have several family restorations in Central Ohio now. Maybe not for a roundtable, but we do need to start looking at those towards some direction.
Hey, I just found that previous work. It was like 10 years ago, but it was in Worthington, and it was Q critical was 40% of the 2-year undeveloped peak discharge. So I think you can go with that unless you got really, really tiny gravels and you think, you know, you need a geomorphic survey.
Thanks, everyone. I'm gonna kick the virtual people out of the room.